This video was created using artificial intelligence, AI, for educational and narrative purposes. All characters and events are fictionalized representations inspired by historical realities. Viewer discretion is advised. You were born into the damp, gray morning of an ancestral home that had begun to rot long before your first breath. The air in the nursery tasted of wet stone and stale tallow. A heavy, airless pressure that settled in your lungs and never truly left. You were the fourth daughter in a lineage that measured worth in land and male heirs, which meant your arrival was not a celebration, but a mathematical error. The floorboards groaned under the weight of a history that had no room for you, and the velvet curtains, once crimson, were now the color of dried blood and dust. There was no soft light in those rooms, only the flickering, inconsistent glow of candles that struggled against the pervasive chill. You learned early that the world did not belong to you. You were merely a guest in a house that was waiting for you to leave, so it could finally collapse in peace. The walls were lined with portraits of men who owned the earth and women who had been traded for it, and as you crawled across the uneven tiles, you were already being weighed against the cost of your own existence. There was no optimism in the way the wet wind rattled the window panes, only the steady, rhythmic reminder that the resources of your family were finite, and you were the surplus that would eventually be discarded. Your father was a shadow that smelled of sour wine and leather, a man who looked through you as if you were a pane of glass that needed cleaning. He did not hate you. Hatred required a level of investment he could not afford to waste on a fourth daughter. To him, you were a line item in a ledger of mounting debts, a dowry he did not have, and a mouth he did not wish to feed. Your mother was a ghost who wandered the corridors, her spirit broken by the repetitive trauma of childbearing, and the suffocating realization that her own life had been a transaction. She did not offer you comfort, because she had none left for herself. When you fell, she did not pick you up. She merely watched with hollow eyes, perhaps envious of the physical pain that distracted you from the existential void of the house. They were not your protectors. They were the architects of your displacement. They spoke of you in the third person while you stood in the room, discussing your future as one might discuss the disposal of a piece of damaged furniture. You were a burden they had inherited from a god they only pretended to love. And their indifference was a cold, sharp blade that pruned away your expectations before they could ever bloom. By the age of 5, your hands were already rough with the labor of survival. You were not given toys. You were given a needle and a thread, instructed to repair the lace that your older, more valuable sisters would wear to the balls you would never attend. Play was a concept you observed from a distance, watching the village children through the iron gates, but within the walls of the estate, movement had to be productive. You spent your days in the scullery or the sewing room, your back aching from the low stools, your eyes straining in the dim light. You were useful before you were loved, and you understood that your standing in the household was tied directly to the speed of your fingers and the silence of your tongue. You carried heavy basins of water that scalded your thin arms, and you learned to anticipate the needs of others so perfectly that you became a ghost in your own home. You were a servant without a wage, a child who had been aged prematurely by the weight of domestic expectation. The laughter of your sisters was a foreign language you could not translate, a sound that only emphasized the grim, mechanical nature of your own daily routine. The law of the land did not see you, and neither did the church, except as a potential vessel for a piety you did not feel. You were unregistered in the grand ambitions of the state, a surplus female in a society that only had roles for wives or corpses. Because your father could not afford a fourth dowry, you did not exist on the marriage market. You were a non-entity, a ghost waiting for a shroud. There were no institutions meant to safeguard your well-being or your education. If you disappeared into the woods or fell into the well, the world would have continued its rotation without a stutter. You were easy to discard because you had never been truly claimed. Your lack of a future was a physical weight, a suffocating realization that you were a placeholder, a temporary resident in the world of the living. The legal documents that defined your family's holdings did not mention your name. You were buried in the "and other children" clause, a collective sigh of a sentence that erased your individuality before you had even mastered your own name. Violence was not an event in your childhood, it was the climate. It was the casual backhand of a frustrated governess, the sharp pinch of a mother who wanted you to stand straighter, and the rhythmic thud of your father's boot against a servant who had been too slow. No one cried out, and no one apologized. You watched a stable boy get beaten until his ribs sang a hollow tune, and the only reaction from the onlookers was a collective looking away. This taught you the most vital lesson of your life. The cost of a human body was negligible. You learned that skin was easily broken and that screams were swallowed by the thick stone walls. You began to see your own body not as a source of joy or strength, but as a liability that could be struck, bruised, or broken at the whim of anyone with a higher title. The world was a series of collisions, and you were the softest object in the room. You learned to flinch before the blow landed, a reflex that would remain with you until the day you died. A permanent twitch in your soul that acknowledged the inevitable arrival of pain. The only warmth you ever knew came from a mangled, half-blind hound that slept in the kitchens. He was as discarded as you were, a creature of scars and low expectations. For a few months, you shared your meager crusts of bread with him, and he, in turn, allowed you to bury your face in his matted fur and weep without judgment. He was your only bond, the only thing in that decaying estate that acknowledged your presence with anything other than resentment. Then, one Tuesday, your father decided the dog was too old to justify its feed. You watched from the nursery window as the animal was led behind the barn. You did not hear the shot, but you saw the way the crows rose from the trees in a sudden black cloud. No one mentioned the dog at dinner. It was as if he had never existed. You realized then that anything you loved would be used as leverage against you, or simply removed to save a few coins. You stopped crying. The well of your grief had been capped with lead. You were truly alone, a singular point of consciousness in a vast, uncaring architecture of stone and social hierarchy. The rescue came in the form of a black carriage and a man in a purple sash. Your father presented your entry into the convent not as a banishment, but as a divine calling. He spoke of the honor of giving a daughter to God, his voice thick with a sudden, performative piety that made your stomach turn. The church presented itself as your salvation, a place where you would be fed, clothed, and protected from the harsh realities of a world that had no place for you. They promised you a community of sisters and a life of holy purpose. They told you that you were becoming a bride of Christ, an elevated status that would wash away the stain of your birth order. It was a lie, constructed to provide a dignified exit for a family that wanted to forget you. The heavy iron gates of the Abbey of the Sacred Heart did not open to welcome you. They opened to swallow you. As the carriage pulled away, leaving you on the cold gravel, you realized that the rescue was merely a transfer of ownership. You had not been saved. You had been institutionalized. The first thing they took was your hair. It fell in long, dark coils onto the cold stone floor, shorn by a woman who did not look at your face. Then they took your clothes, replacing the silk and linen of your former life with the heavy, abrasive wool of the habit. Finally, they took your name. You were no longer the girl who remembered the smell of the sea or the feel of the blind dog's fur. You were Sister Maria of the Sorrows. You were given a number for the laundry and a seat in the chapel that was determined by the date of your profession. Your body was hidden beneath layers of black and white, a deliberate erasure of your form and your autonomy. You were told to keep your eyes cast down, to never look a superior in the eye, and to speak only when the rule permitted. Within a week, you were a shadow among shadows. When you looked in the polished metal that served as a mirror, you did not recognize the person staring back. The girl you had been was dead, buried under a mountain of liturgy and wool, and no one had bothered to say a prayer for her. The convent was not a sanctuary. It was a factory of discipline. The hierarchy was absolute and crushing. At the top was the Mother Superior, a woman whose word was the voice of God and whose favor was the only currency. Below her were the choir nuns, the daughters of the high nobility who brought large dowries and were given the lighter tasks. Then there were the lay sisters, women like you, whose families had paid just enough to keep them from the streets, but not enough to buy them comfort. You were the disposable engine of the abbey. You woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of a brass bell that felt like a needle in your brain. You scrubbed the flagstones until your knees were a map of raw, weeping sores. You worked in the damp laundry until the lye ate the skin off your knuckles. You were taught that obedience was the highest virtue, and that any spark of willfulness was a temptation from the devil. You were at the bottom of a very old, very heavy pyramid, and the weight of every stone above you was designed to keep you pinned to the floor. Your body ceased to be yours. It became a resource for the institution. It was a tool for labor, used to till the kitchen gardens and haul the heavy sacks of grain. It was a vessel for obedience, forced into hours of kneeling on hard oak until your joints locked in agony. It was a canvas for punishment. For the sin of falling asleep during matins, you were forced to lie prostrate at the chapel door, so that the other sisters could step over you. Your consent was never requested, because it was understood to have been surrendered at the gate. Even your sleep was not your own, interrupted by the relentless cycle of the divine office. You were perpetually cold, perpetually hungry, and perpetually exhausted. The system did not want your soul. It wanted your stamina. It wanted to see how much of you could be ground away before you finally broke. You were a biological machine fueled by thin cabbage soup and the fear of eternal damnation, and your only function was to maintain the silence and the structure of the walls that held you. In the 3rd year of your internment, you met Sister Claire. She was younger than you, with hands that trembled when she held the heavy psalter. You found each other in the darkness of the cellar, where you were both sent to sort rotting potatoes. In the damp quiet, away from the watchful eyes of the mistress of novices, you whispered. You did not talk of God or the rule. You talked of the world outside, the taste of honey, the sound of a flute at a fair, the way the sun felt on bare skin. For a brief window of time, you were a person again. You shared the secret burden of your humanity, forming a bond that was the only fragile piece of light in the gray expanse of your life. You touched her hand once, a brief, terrifying contact that felt more sacred than any relic in the chapel. She was the mirror that reflected back a version of you that was still alive, still capable of feeling something other than the crushing weight of duty. This connection was your only rebellion, a quiet, desperate insistence that you were more than a number in a ledger. The destruction of that bond was systematic and cold. The Mother Superior had noticed the way your eyes lingered on Claire during the Great Silence. In a community built on the erasure of the individual, such a connection was a malignancy. They did not accuse you of a crime. They simply informed you that Claire was being transferred to a sister house across the mountains to deepen her spiritual growth. You were not allowed to say goodbye. You watched from the high, narrow window of the infirmary as she was bundled into a cart in the pre-dawn mist. You saw her looking back at the stone walls, her face a mask of terror. You never saw her again, and you never heard her name spoken. The message was clear. Attachment was a path to suffering. The system had identified your last source of joy and had surgically removed it to ensure your total dependence on the institution. You realized then that the walls were not there to keep the world out. They were there to ensure that nothing could ever grow inside. To survive the remaining decades, you cultivated a profound anesthesia. You did not turn to drugs, for there were none, but you turned to the rhythm of the hours. You buried your consciousness in the repetitive drone of the Latin Psalms, words you chanted thousands of times until they lost all meaning and became a hypnotic, numbing vibration in your throat. You embraced a cold, mechanical duty, performing your tasks with a precision that was devoid of spirit. You became a statue that breathed. When the winter cold cracked your skin, or the summer heat made your habit a suffocating cage, you felt it from a great distance, as if it were happening to someone else. You leaned into the numbness, welcoming the way it deadened your memories of the sun and the blind dog and Claire. You were not holy, you were merely vacant. Survival required the death of the self, and you were a very efficient executioner. You lived for 40 years inside that silence, a ghost haunting the corridors of a tomb you had helped to build. You died in the infirmary during a particularly bitter February. The room smelled of vinegar and old age. There was no one at your bedside to hold your hand or whisper your name. The sister on duty was busy at the other end of the ward, tending to a novice with a fever. Your death was a quiet, rattling affair, a final surrender of a breath you had been holding for half a century. There was no justice for the life you had been denied, no recognition of the girl who had been traded for a dowry. Your body, thin and worn as a piece of old parchment, was washed, wrapped in a simple linen shroud, and buried in the cloister garden before the sun had fully set. The earth was hard and unforgiving, and the priest mumbled the prayers for the dead with a speed that suggested he had somewhere better to be. Your passing did not disrupt the schedule of the abbey. The bell for vespers rang at the appointed time, and the other sisters filed into the chapel, their faces hidden, their voices rising in the same mechanical drone that had been the soundtrack of your erasure. 300 years later, a historian walks through the ruins of your convent. He carries a notebook and a digital camera, looking for the grand narrative of the era. He writes about the architectural significance of the Gothic arches and the political influence of the Mother Superiors who corresponded with kings. He does not find your name because it was never recorded in anything but a fading laundry list and a burial register that was lost to a fire in the 19th century. The records he consults praise the convent as a center of medieval stability and feminine piety, a place where devout women found peace away from the turmoils of the world. Your suffering has left no trace on the stone. There is no monument to the fourth daughters, no plaque for the women whose identities were shorn away by the shears of social convenience. The grass grows tall over your unmarked grave, nourished by the remains of 1,000 women just like you, whose lives were consumed by a system that needed their silence more than their souls. The sun sets over the ruins, and the world moves on, the same brutal calculations of worth and waste continuing in the shadows, indifferent to the ghosts who were never allowed to live.